from my side, yes.
All right, thank you. So let's look at cell death. Cells do die. They die through two major ways. So we are going to look at that. Uh, and why is it actually very important that we really know how cells die and why it is very, very key. We need to know the different ways and the how or and know that the chemical changes that happen when a cell is dying by apoptosis, and explain the processes of or the pathway, the apoptotic pathways that cells actually take. So that is what we are going to look at. So cells can die through two processes. One is apoptosis, and then the second one is necrosis. So apoptosis is when the cell is basically what we call as programmed cell death. Okay, the reactions that result into cell death in apoptosis are initiated within or even or extracellularly, but this reaction, this death of the cell is clean and does not result into damaging of the neighboring cell. Okay, so for example, our skin has we have skills as cells that peel off, that die off from our skin, but new cells are being formed. But you can't really see that with your naked eye because these cells are dying in a programmed normal way, and we can call it suicidal. Whereas with necrosis, this is where you're having the cell dying because of an injury. This injury can be a forceful mechanical injury or an injury because of chemical heat or even lack of oxygen, which is hypoxia. Okay, when this happens, it causes local inflammation and therefore it can damage the neighboring cell. So the cell doesn't die on its own, but it also affects the neighboring cells. So those are the two different ways in which cells actually die. So what happens if the cell actually dies in a programmed way? Okay, that means that there is a sequence of reactions that are set into motion for the cell to die. So what do we see if the cell is dying? Usually you see the cell condensing or the genetic material getting condensed. The cell membrane usually remains intact. And the nature of the reactions that happen inside the cell, where we have capsaicins, which are enzymes that break down some of the components of this cell which is about to die, being activated, and they require actually energy to do that. Okay, so the cell will actually die without having impact on the neighboring cells or even in the tissue. So there will be no tissue reaction. So apoptosis happens in two major pathways. It can be intrinsic or extrinsic. So we are going to look at each of these. When we talk about intrinsic pathway, we are basically referring to the cell initiating its own death as a result of either being exposed to radiation, hypoxia, that is low oxygen, or even high calcium concentration, or oxidative stress. So exposure to that will result into the release of cytochrome C from the mitochondria. And then this cytochrome cytochrome C will set a series of reactions that will lead to the activation of enzymes called the caspase enzymes. So these enzymes are very important in destroying some of the substrates within the cell, and this eventually results into the cell death. Okay, this is the extrinsic pathway, not the intrinsic pathway here. Let me just see if I can correct that here. Yeah, so the extrinsic pathway happens through macrophages. Macrophages, like we talked about yesterday, are some of the important phagocytic cells in the body. They recognize cells that are very old, or cells that are diseased, like the ones we call pathogenic cells, and that these cells need to be removed. Okay, so the macrophages can initiate apoptosis through the extrinsic pathway. What they do is that the macrophages release a chemical called the tumor necrosis factor alpha, which is basically a signaling protein. This protein can bind to its receptor, and then this causes confirmatory or conformational change in the death domain, and this results into proteins being activated and forming what we call the death-inducing signaling complex, and this now activates caspase enzymes that lead to apoptosis. Okay, so basically the extrinsic pathway and the intrinsic pathway both involve the caspase enzymes, because they're the ones that actually break down the cellular substrates. All right, so we can end here for this presentation. If you have any questions,